It is now my pleasure to introduce Gregory Pardlo, author of Air Traffic. Gregory Pardlo is the author of Digest, winner of the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. Digest was also nominated for an NAACP Image Award, named a standout book by the Academy of American Poets, a New York Times Best Poetry Book of the Year, and a finalist for the Hurston Wright Legacy Award and Indie Fab Book of the Year. Gregory Pardlo's other awards include fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the New York Foundation for the Arts. His first poetry collection, Totem, won the American Poetry Review Honickman First Book Prize in 2007. He is poetry editor of Virginia Quarterly Review and lives in Brooklyn with his wife and 2 kids. Air Traffic explores questions of race, family, and American culture. By turns emotional, analytic, ironic, and angry, the book covers Pardlo's youth, brief Marine Reserve stint, marriage, parenthood, and everything in between. At the heart of all of his experiences is Pardlo's complicated relationship with his father, who was one of the 11,000 plus air traffic controllers fired by Reagan in 1981. As book list notes, endlessly introspective, wide-ranging, and lucid, Pardlo's fearless inventory stuns with beautifully written, fully saturated snapshots of rich and complicated familial love. Without further ado, please join me in warmly welcoming Gregory Pardlo to Politics and Prose.
Thanks, everyone. Great. I applaud you for coming out tonight. I really appreciate you coming on this gorgeous day. It was pretty chilly coming out of New York, so I was thrilled to get here and discover the weather that you guys had. So this came out last week, 2 weeks ago, and I'm still figuring out how to talk about the book. So each time I give a reading, I realize something else about it. And so I decided what I'm going to do is whenever I give a reading, I will share with you the new thing I realized that I'm doing with the book. So the new thing that I discovered is that I'm asking about personal transformation. So my father was an air traffic controller at 81, as we heard, and he identified so closely with the job that I'm not confident he was able to. So once the job is taken away, he was forced to reinvent himself. He was forced to find some new identity. And I think this was the I don't want to call it failing, but the challenge of his life from then on, is that he had great difficulty reimagining who he was, creating a new narrative for himself. And so I'm asking the question whether or not one can reinvent themselves without having gone through some kind of personal trauma. Right? So we know about rock bottoming out as alcoholic. You heard this story. And there are people who have varying. We talk about someone with a high bottom or a low bottom. People have different experiences constitute different moments of forced change. Can we decide at some point on our own, of our own volition, to say, I'm going to reinvent myself. I'm going to tell a new narrative about who I am. So, that's kind of tickled. I realized what was going on there. It's like, now I can tell somebody what I think I'm doing. So what I'm going to do tonight is read a couple of sections from the book. Not necessarily connected. Well, yeah, they're connected. Because as we also heard, the book goes quite a bit around. It travels quite a bit in terms of ideas. An introduction, Route 66. And this is the very beginning of the book. By some concoction of sugar, nicotine, prescription painkillers, rancor, and cocaine, my father, Gregory Pardlo Sr., began killing himself after my parents separated in 2007. He measured his health and lifestyle against his will to live and determined he had 10 years left in the tank. Though he did screw up and live past 65, I'm changing the term here. as he was afraid he might, he was only a year over budget. I hear some children in the background. He lived his last years like a child with a handful of tokens at an arcade near closing time. Those tokens included access to credit, the patience and generosity of his family and friends, and any saleable assets, including, possibly, the titanium urn that contained his mother's ashes, mysteriously missing from the one-bedroom Las Vegas apartment where he chose to fizzle out. These resources had to be exhausted. He didn't want to endure penury, but neither would he ever leave money on the table, as he often put it. He died without leaving a will or naming beneficiaries. My brother, Robbie, and I agreed to have him cremated. No medical school would have taken him, and I didn't even entertain the idea of a casket. Robbie traveled from Willingboro, New Jersey, to Vegas to claim the body. My father had retired as a union representative for the American Train Dispatchers Association, ATDA. But without a will, my mother had to negotiate unfamiliar bureaucracies even to claim the $2,000 grievance pay the ATDA provided to cover his funeral. My father left an assortment of defaulted mortgages, overdrawn bank accounts, and maxed out credit cards, the remaining balance on a luxury sports car he had all but totaled, and a 5-figure debt to the taxman. He died May 12, 2016, as I was working on the final drafts of this book. Writing the book gave me an excuse to talk to him. Each time I interviewed him by phone from my house in Brooklyn, I was prepared for that to have been the last time we spoke. Yet even with all my psychic and emotional preparation for his death, it was a poignant exercise to have to comb through these pages and change verb forms from present tense to past. Robbie initially believed, sincerely I suspect, that our father died of a broken heart. Robbie's story of our dad's death and life is very different from mine. I'm 10 years older. I have a bigger file on our parents. Our mother and father were kids when they had me in 1968. They were 21 and 19, respectively. In the heyday before 1981, before my father lost his job as an air traffic controller in the infamous strike that ended with Ronald Reagan firing 13,000 federal employees, my parents' spirits were high. They wanted a second child, so much so that after miscarrying one who'd already entered the family imagination as Heather, they succeeded in having Robbie. Robbie was born in 1979. We were a boomtown under a single roof. The father I imprinted on was infinitely capable and resourceful, and as far as my child's eye view could tell, had the world on a leash. Robbie knew a less idealistic, chastened version of our father, by then a man who was resigned to having been blackballed from the career that defined him. By the time Robbie outgrew the hypoallergenic cloth diapers that were delivered to our house once a month, Dad was, if only for lack of alternatives, more involved in domestic life. The father I grew up with still resented the competing demands of an unplanned offspring. I was the mistake that he felt he was nobly taking responsibility for, and I was thus made to suffer the flexing of Big Greg's narcissism in all its demonstrative and petty renditions. I don't mean this in a self-pitying way. Whereas he wanted from me a show of gratitude, I studied him. He interpreted my scrutiny as insubordination. This made our lives adversarial. Robbie, at least symbolically, was a comfort to him. I was a threat. I was my father's rival, and he was mine. This may sound wildly self-important, but this is the prerogative, my father would agree, of the one who has survived the other. There's a picture of me in my mother's arms on my first birthday. Voodoo child, star child, love child. My first birthday was a Monday, lunes, day of the moon. It was the day my mother turned 22. Every year, the same tired joke. Happy birthday, I'd grin, empty-handed and pitiful. I was the gift, the reminder of what she gave of herself to herself, that she must tow through the cosmos in a contrapuntal orbit. I have always belonged to her through the infinite umbilicus of fate, a Taoist return to my origins revealed in this annual eclipse, November 24th, the shared anniversary of our births. What grief, what blemished self-image did she need to bury that she would risk an accidental pregnancy with a man as superficial as my father? Yet my guilt over being the unexpected orange detour arrow of her life elevated me in importance over my father's fleeting diversions. Good and bad, I was beyond evaluation, the fulcrum of every story she might devise to tell of her life. My parents' marriage collapsed like a shoddy circus tent on the evening we held the launch party for my first book of poems. The Creative Writers House at New York University, where I completed my Master of Fine Arts degree in poetry, hosted the party. It was the fall of 2007. My father was a jealous man for his wife's attention, the success of others, and the attention of the crowd. This was the kind of a crowd he coveted most: my old classmates, colleagues, and writer friends. If I'd only asked him to make a toast that night at the launch party, he might have been in better spirits. If he felt acknowledged, he might still be alive. That's a wild leap, I know, but thoughts like this crossed my mind. Before the party ended, he picked a fight with my mother. After he drove her 2 hours down the turnpike to our hometown of Willingboro, dropped her off at her father Bob's house, and told her not to come home, she discovered that he had taken her house keys from her purse. According to my mother, he wouldn't say what had provoked him or why he was upset. But I know he was throwing a tantrum over having been ignored at the book party. He was acting out. A true diva will not be upstaged. In April of 2015, days after it was announced that I'd won the Pulitzer Prize for my second book of poems, I still hadn't heard from my dad. Most of our communication was via text message because he would get winded and need to rest after a few minutes of talking. I wanted to know if he'd heard the news, if the news had reached him yet. He texted back, "When a Roman general conquered a town, Caesar would send a slave to ride alongside the general in the victory parade and remind the general that he was only human." The last time I saw him was August 2015, at the party my mother threw at a hotel in Marlton, New Jersey, to celebrate the prize. I was surprised he made it all the way from Las Vegas to Marlton. What a wreck he had become physically. During our rare phone conversations, he complained about the multiplying failures of his body. He couldn't walk 5 feet without losing his breath, so he'd often sit near exits where he could get out easily to have a smoke. He lost half his right leg to diabetes, refusing to give up the junk foods he equated with his dignity. He was incontinent. It took a Herculean effort for him to be there in both the emotional and physical senses, an effort you'd think was motivated by pride in his son's achievement. But I knew, as perhaps only a son can know, that I was the opening act. My father loved me and was indeed proud of me in his complicated way, but he came to Marlton for the crowd. He came with his motorized chair and his life-extending contraptions to give his final performance. He looked glorious, the old bull, in his matching suede jacket and pants. Determined, he ditched the chair and stood on his prosthesis, no doubt imagining himself in the mode of some hard-bitten pirate declaiming from the quarterdeck. He gave a speech that congratulated me by commemorating his own place in the history, situated generationally, as he explained, between two titans, his father and me. We were the giants standing on his shoulders. My father didn't suffer from humility. He thought it was a deceitful affect. He favored potential over humility and believed that showing the latter prevents indulging the former. Potential is a promissory note always worth more. Not more than, just more. With humility, what you see is what you get. My druthers lie somewhere between, and this book studies that overlap. Can one aspire to St. Augustine's humility? When I got sober and began working the steps, I got stuck on the one that says, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. This book is my step 4. That I have failed is evident in my digressions and indulgences, but the 8 remaining steps are full of promise. So I'm going to skip to the chapter. The book is written in essays. the manuscript that I submitted to the publisher was a collection of essays. What the editor sent me back was a memoir. And, well, the marching orders that I got back was, the essays arranged in more or less a narrative arc, and then, lots of suggested changes to tie them all together. So I still haven't figured out how to talk about them. I don't want to call them chapters, but this is a much later section.
Can you tell us?
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm reading from Cartography, 84. And to give you the scene, I had a moped when I was maybe 12, 13, and I suspected a kid in the neighborhood stole my moped, and I was determined to get it back. So that's what this section is, among many other things. All night, I schemed a course to the joiner's yard to retrieve my moped. Calling the police wasn't an option because I was not sure how the kid I bought it from came into possession of the moped in the first place. The deal was brokered by this other kid I met outside the school pool. Dude said he knew where I could get a cheap moped when he saw me admiring his. There was a paranoid urgency to the arrangement. Now, as I plotted my revenge, the last thing I wanted to consider was the possibility that the moped I bought might have been stolen from Tyrone, or that Tyrone might have known the person to whom it belonged. The whole way home from Newby's the best friend. The whole way home from Newby's, I spent discrediting the scenario in which Tyrone, walking by my house, had noticed the moped on my porch and recognized it as his own. We lived on a cul-de-sac, I reasoned, and so there was no way Tyrone could have coincidentally glimpsed the moped. No. The only circumstance that might explain his wandering into visual range of my porch was if he was roaming the streets after curfew, looking for trouble. It did not occur to me that he might have watched from a window as I rode it up the driveway of Noob's house, directly across from his, any day during the few summer weeks before this. Only one of the 5 joiner boys, Herman, was of driving age, despite the small fleet of vehicles in the driveway. There was an old conversion van that stood in the pooling rubber of its flat tires gathering pine needles. There was a dented moss-green F-150 touched up in several places with primer and a sparkling lime green paint. There was a champagne Seville with a sloped rear trunk and a rotating cast of economy cars that must have been won at auction because there were usually numbers written in grease pencil on the side window and temp tags in the rear. They lived in a model called the Gramercy, a 2-story colonial with 4 bedrooms and a 2-car garage. It was a color my dad would have called doo-doo brown, with caramel shutters and a navy blue trim around the doors and windows. Had the mother ever harbored ambitions of tending a flower garden, she'd long since abandoned them. A few random twiggy shrubs were the only plants to prong the well-packed dirt skirting the house. The garage doors were occasionally left open during the day, giving view to an assortment of dirt bikes and quads. What anyone in that family would need with my misfiring, oil-burning, third-hand at best moped was beyond me, and yet there he was, Tyrone, pushing my ride through every thought in my mind. My ride, which came nearly up to his chest, so that as he wheeled it around the house and into his backyard, he looked, in the image congealed in my memory, as if he were bulldogging a heavily drugged steer into the chute for slaughter. Midnight expeditions with Newby, rambling as we called it, had always been exciting because we were breaking curfew. We didn't have an agenda, we were just bored. Unlike Tyrone, we had no interest in breaking any ordinances other than curfew itself. It was as simple as a game of tag. Don't get caught. First, Noob and I pool hopped at school pools. Then one night, Noob brought a guest to our 1 a.m. meeting place, the bandshell in Broido Park. This was the park where Debbie T would soon teach me to tongue kiss. The park where I would hear live music for the first time from musicians not wearing tuxedos. Anyway, Noob had with him that first night the knuckle-headed Iranian kid who lived on the next street down the hill behind Noob's. After that, our crew grew incrementally and soon resembled a pack of zombie-eyed preteens wild with the night's musk, liberated from our circuits between school and ColecoVision consoles. That's when I knew enough to bail. Here's proof God loves fools and children. The first night I chose to stay home was the night the Ramblers broke protocol and decided to throw pebbles at some late-night beer-drinking rednecks. This was a couple of weeks before summer break, and we were all impatient with school. Someone was bound to act out. When Noob appeared in school the next morning with his nose taped and both eyes blackened, I didn't care if anybody called me a wuss for having bailed. The gossip that went around later in the day was that police had rounded up all the kids who were out that night, and some who weren't, after they caught the reigning kid and forced him to name names. It gave me great material for busting on Noob, but nobody but him got to hear it because Noob's parents didn't allow him out for the rest of the summer. Because my name miraculously hadn't appeared on the Iranian kids list, I was the only person allowed to visit Noob at home, which is how we got so good at ping pong. Like practice runs, those earlier outings had served me well after all. There was a system in place and I knew it. I knew whose parents stayed up late watching television, which empty nests were shut up tight like beach houses in the off-season. As I made my way to the joiners to repo my ride, I knew which yards I could safely cut through, staying off the street and out of the lights. I'd even thought to leave the screen to my bedroom window open to avoid the shush and click racket of raising it. It was only the shutter of the window frame and the sash, and the flash of my Jack Purcells disappearing over the sill. I vaulted out the window and crouched behind the forsythia to survey the street. Shadows swaying like kelp played over my neighbor's Trans Am parked in the street, condensation pebbling its broad rear window. The voice of Johnny Carson echoed from bedrooms as if the whole neighborhood were a well-dispersed drive-in theater. I took the fenceless cut-throughs. I didn't want to risk disrupting lullabies with the shimmer clang of a chain link under my leaping 115-pound frame. Originally, fences were prohibited in the Long Island Levittown. Open and accessible common space was meant to foster cohesion among residents. This must have been one of Alfred's ideas. It was for just these sorts of kumbaya design features that Bill Levitt muscled his little brother out of the family business. So the Levitt family, Levitt and Sons, built 3 full-scale towns. Levittown on Long Island, with Levittown in Pennsylvania, and mine, which is called Willingboro. By the time he broke ground on Willingboro, his last development, Bill couldn't give a rat's ass whether or not residents felt like they lived in a cohesive community. He owned a big old yacht. One longer-lived feature of the 2 previous Levitt towns was the successful exclusion of Negroes, as opposed to the unsuccessful, if also fervently pursued, efforts to keep out Jews. I'm not speculating which prohibition the Levitt Corporation dispensed with first in those communities preceding Willingboro, the prohibition on fences or the prohibition on Negroes, but at least in my own mind, the 2 have a syllogistic relationship. What conditions allowed Willingboro, in contrast to nearly every other municipality in Burlington County, to become such a haven for middle-class black families? Maybe residents decided fences were a good idea after all when they found out who was moving in. Or maybe it was the installation of fences that disrupted, as Alfred might have predicted, the bonding process among neighbors enough to give black homebuyers a chance to slip through those divided ranks in increasing numbers without lighting up the phone trees. Whether they were intended to wall in or wall out, though, fences were the norm in Willingboro. It was so rare to find a fenceless yard, I figured that the household must be philosophically committed to accessible common spaces, idealists hoping to ride out a downturn in the market of human sociability. And these folks would surely welcome my trespass anyway. The kind of stockade fences I encountered at the joiners generally guarded a swimming pool, so I expected to find a kidney-shaped sheen at the center of their yard, dark as a tar pit in the night, or a precipitous cedar ledge surrounding an above-ground pool, its fiberglass pump half successfully obscured by a trellis with potted ivy. But upon climbing the only tree with a limb high and strong enough to reach with a limb high and strong enough to reach from their neighbor's side yard out over the joiner's fence. All I could see was a large patch of dirt spreading just beyond the shed in the corner to the right of the sliding glass door. The shed must have been made by Mr. Joyner himself, because it looked more like something out of a documentary about life in a shanty town than anything purchased off the sidewalk outside Rickles Hardware. There it was, teetering on its stand by the rear door of the garage to the left of the kitchen's sliding glass door, partly disassembled, my moped. Shinnying out to where the tree limb dipped and then braced against the top of the fence, I let myself drop into the spiky arms of one of the yew bushes lined along the perimeter. Just as I did this, I heard the sliding glass door open like the lid on a can of baked beans. Whoever opened the door, thank God, was too distracted with the dog being let out to notice the top of the bush I'd fallen into flapping in the shadows across the yard. I tried to keep everything still as I stared up at clouds bright as teeth in a black-light nightclub, but couldn't resist peeking out to see Mr. Joyner clip the dog's collar to the nylon leash. Who the heck would keep a Pomeranian on a leash in the yard, I wondered. Though he did seem happy to be there, a little fluff ball, bright and curious as he spotted what his master had not. He was quiet about it too, the dog. It was our secret. I like the little guy. I'm having fun replacing all the curse words here. Finally, Mr. Joyner tracked back into the house, and like a roach, I scrambled around the yard out of sight. I couldn't tell which parts went where. So many of them were laid out on a bedsheet on the ground beneath the moped. The seat and gas tank had been removed and now leaned in the shadows against the house. Although it was dark and there was no evidence of this, I was certain Tyrone was preparing to repaint my moped properly. At least in the dark, there was nothing to suggest this was not my moped. Then again, reassembling it was well beyond me. I would have to repossess the moped and take it to the bike shop to get it back in working order, which would surely cost me more than the thing was worth to begin with. I had to abort the mission in the hope that when I did get my ride back, Tyrone would have it running better than it had before he stole it. Trying to sort all of this out in the joiner's yard, I was distracted. I couldn't focus. I couldn't help myself. I had to pet the dog. And then it occurred to me. I'll stop there. Of course, you know what happens next. I steal the dog. I kidnap the dog.
Well, would it be a spoiler if you told us if you got your moped back?
No, because I actually don't. Sorry. I actually don't talk about. The story ends before I reveal whether or not I get the moped back. And the point being, of course, that the moped being stolen was not the point of the piece. But between us, no, I did not get my moped. Well, that's not true. I did. So there was a police officer who was friends with my parents who lived in the neighborhood. A black police officer, and somehow it must have been orchestrated through my mom or dad. And he came to me and said, we're trying to keep black kids out of jail. So if I can get your moped back, you'll agree not to press charges. So, okay. Sounds good. I got it back and it was just a piece of junk. It was just he very hastily threw everything back together. So it was absolutely worthless. But it was a lesson.
Thank you for your reading. You're a wonderful storyteller.
Oh, thank you.
I enjoyed listening. So I have some questions about fathers and your dad. Your brother's comment that your dad maybe died from a broken heart resonated with me because I think that happened to my dad who lost his career and so much of his identity was tied up in that. So that kind of rings true to me. Series of heart attacks, but I call it a broken heart.
Yeah, sure.
So, what part of your father lives on in you?
Well, that's Thank you. That's another one of the big questions I'm asking. I think more subtly in the book, but I'm trying to figure out. Maybe, I guess it is another one of the questions I'm asking. How much of my identity can I take responsibility for? I mean, the way I think about myself, not my external identity. Because certainly, as I interact with my kids, I find my father, ventriloquizing my dad quite a bit. Throughout the book, I beat up on my dad a lot. Right? I'm at times, I think in the introduction it was mentioned that I'm angry. At times there is anger, outright anger. But there's also the admission that I admired and, as I said, I did mention, emulated, I imitated my father for a very long time, to the point that I imitated a lot of the negative stuff. So I think as a young adult, my impulse was to say, "Oh, my father screwed me up. He ruined my life. If I had only had a healthier dad, a more functional dad, I would have had a happier life." But of course, years of therapy later, he didn't do that bad, right? I mean, he did some stuff that's pretty cool, and I think that the deep programming of values is the thing that I'm trying to speak to in the book.
Can you hear me, Greg?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thanks so much for writing this. I largely read it in a single setting. And I have to say, I came away. This is one of the books that I come away with so many questions from.
Awesome. And we'll just scoot the microphone out so you can stand behind it.
Yeah. And then I thought, well, maybe I should ask him the most innocent question. But I
can I tell you something really quick? So I recorded the Terry Gross a few days ago. It's going to be aired tomorrow, and Terry Gross is nice. We hear her voice is just so kind, and it was a setup. It was an ambush. Terry goes hard. Terry was gangster. So the first few questions were nice, and so how did this happen? Tell me about this. And it was like, so how did you feel about blah blah? And then it was like, here on page so and so, you write this. What do you say? And she went like right to the most exposed nerves in the book. So I think I'm ready for your question.
Well, it is coming on page 139. I don't know if Terry Gross, but the book is so provocative. This essay or chapter
or Shelker.
Whoa, this is a doozy. And I have to say, there is a closing paragraph of this section. It's a section that starts out talking about shame. And the paragraph begins, shame is healthy, but there's that last sentence in that paragraph. Whoa, I read this, and I keep reading it, and I think, I wonder if he could elaborate.
Are the kids on?
What is the
sentence? I'm going to read it for you. I'll read it, yeah. I'll read the paragraph. If I can set up the hurrah for Shelker. It's too much to set up. Shame is healthy. It keeps us from doing dumb shit. I would not put fried chicken in a poem just to thumb my nose at decorum. Oh, so I should actually set up. So talking about stereotypes and playing into stereotypes and resisting stereotypes. So I'm going to back up just a little bit. While many of us decry those veils of identity we call stereotypes, especially when they're projected onto us, some others of us embrace stereotypes. Embracing them can be comforting, a way of announcing we belong somewhere, if not perhaps here. defending his right to populate his poems unapologetically with images he considers true, regardless of whether or not they're stereotypical, a promising young poet said to me once, "But I do like fried chicken." "Yes," I said, "and I like white women. But these are cliches, no matter the hateful inferences they bear, and so the rootstock of monster making." He means he wants to express his cultural conditioning without shame or apology. I know, which is as admirable as it is naive. Shame is healthy. It keeps us from doing dumb shit. I would not put fried chicken in a poem just to thumb my nose at decorum, nor would I espouse a taste for white women in a poem unless the point was to trouble the cultural foundations on which that ideological house is built. What's shameful is when poets, writers, artists deny culpability for perpetuating stereotypes, or worse yet, when we champion stereotypes to pander to our readers' need to believe in a predictable, knowable world. And that was the sentence. So you're asking about the role, the writer's responsibility. The thing that's bothering me there is, so I divide, oversimplifying, I divide poetry up into, there is affirmational poetry, and then there is poetry that disturbs what we feel we confidently know about the world, that unsettles, that makes us think about things in different ways, think about ourselves differently. And I'm reacting against, I'm sort of taking a jab at the readers. Generally, we know as readers, it's nice to read the beach reading, the comforting airport reading. It's not challenging. It doesn't ask us to do any work of reflection or self-interrogation. You just move through it. You say, yes, that is the world exactly as I know it. And that's nice. It is tempting as a poet, or as any writer, to write toward that desire on the part of the reader, to flatter the reader, to, if not, patronize the reader. And one of the ways that I think is rather deplorable that we, and I think I call myself out on this too, patronize readers is by playing toward familiar stereotypes. Saying, I know this is how you... So, for example, the poem about some urban mean street, the black guy is writing about the urban mean streets and how the police are always, the evil kind of specter, and all of the kind of Moynihan ills of the community are shoveled into the poem. So in order to have a reader say, yeah, doesn't that suck? Yeah, and you walk away and you've challenged nothing, you've thought nothing about it, just articulated things that reinforce the sense that, yeah, the world is screwed up in these ways, and I was right. So I'm advocating kind of art that unsettles the challenges, that makes people slightly uncomfortable. And as you no doubt heard here and will hear throughout the book, I am inclined to make provocative statements in order precisely to prod the reader and create those kinds of disturbances. Thanks. Yes?
Hello there. I'm reading your book. I'm enjoying it.
Thank you.
Very beautifully written. Okay, so you said you submitted it to your editor as essays, separate essays, right? And it came back to you as narrative.
Well, it came back suggested to be right.
She didn't rewrite it.
She didn't rewrite it, no.
She didn't rewrite it. Well, how did you feel about that? And could it have worked as essay?
You mean as a straight memoir? Oh, yeah, no, I see what you're saying. I'm sorry. I see your question. Well, this is the question that Dwayne was just asking me about the sort of poems of affirmation versus a book that challenges. I think the book that I originally wanted to write, I mean, I think this book is still challenging enough that I don't feel like I've compromised my integrity at all. But my first reaction was, you just want to commercialize my work. You just want to, make it conform to this industry standard. And I was, offended and righteous, and then I thought, I got kids. I got a mortgage. All right. I can bend a little. Yeah. So yeah, I think it would have worked as straight essays, but that's always the trade-off. Yeah. Thanks. So,
Hi, thank you for your reading. As I sat there listening to you initially, I was rooting for your father, hoping that he would recover from the experience. I do recall the traffic control situation, and it was a fairly lengthy period. So I was wondering, at the initial strike, did it occur to your father that this thing may go in the direction it was going, and that perhaps he should consider something else? But as I was listening to you, it seems he had a lot of issues that would get in the way, that would prevent him from rebounding such a horrific experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a large part of what the book is asking. So in the moment of the strike, Reagan says you have 48 hours to go back to work or else you're fired. And so as I'm saying, my editor challenges me to compromise in this very small way. I can only imagine my father being faced with the decision that he was faced with in terms of the strike. He chose not to go back. And so it wasn't even a question of whether or not Reagan would do it. I mean, before the strike, everyone in the union was absolutely confident. And the joke was, and I write about this, the joke was, what are they going to do, fire us all? And so, and the hubris, all the cockiness of not just my dad, but the whole culture of that union in that moment was so, we cannot lose, that I'm trying to imagine what it's like to be the cold water that Reagan threw on them in that moment. I know over the course of writing the book, I got to meet some people some people whose parents, whose fathers, did go back in that moment. I'm also struggling, or kind of trying to figure out whether or not I resent my father for not going back. Right? He put us all in grave risk.
Why he didn't go back?
Well, like I said, there was ego, there was his integrity, this was his commitment, and it's fascinating. The union the strike can only work if you have 100% participation, and they all went over the cliff together. Yeah. And so in a sense, I'm absolutely as proud of my dad. He stuck to his guns, as we say. So he held his integrity. But at the same time, at the risk of absolutely everything. I mean, literally everything, except the house itself.
Curious how your writing changes now that you've put such a personal autobiography out, and whether you've been writing your poetry during this period. Have you seen any changes?
Yeah, I actually think I'm less concerned. I'm less protective of my flaws, and I'm less ashamed, actually. I'm not sure that's always a good thing as I'm looking at the poems that I'm writing now, because I had been writing fairly confessional poems already, but they were structured in kind of intellectual ways, and right, there was the language was the true thing. And now I think the poems that I'm writing now, which is not to say the poems that I'm publishing now, but the poems I'm writing now are I think a lot more throw the barn doors open and, let it all hang out. And I hold on to, I reserve the right to discipline those poems before I send them out into the world. But I know that having written this, my impulse now is to, what do you got to lose at this point? Right, and some of that is I want to use myself as the kind of, I don't know why this thing just coming to mind, as the fetal pig on which I experiment the psychologically. And so part of it is having written this book, I have some distance, some objective distance over my flaws, so that I don't feel like, God, I'm such an awful person. What a horrible human being. I can see that, it's got flaws, whatever. Let's make art. Hopefully. Thank you very much. Yeah.